A very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Mohammad Imtiaz and I'll be moderating today's session. With a brief note, though, Dr. Amir Ali is a well-known public figure in the realm of political studies and in the subject of political science. But though, as a part of our conventionality, I'll just try to give a brief introduction of Professor Amir Ali. Dr. Amir Ali teaches at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. Previously, he taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, from 2004 to 2007, and was Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2012 to 2014. His areas of research are multiculturalism, group rights, and British politics. His latest published books are South Asian Islam and British Multiculturalism. And the upcoming book is the Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty, and Nation State. That will be published by the July of this year, hopefully. So it's like I might take a minute to describe my emotion to Dr. Amir Ali. It's likely because I have been following you, sir, since I was a student in graduation in Jamia Millia Islamia. So through your work, we have got to know that how well you have been working in the area of multiculturalism. And through our professors, we have always been heard and listened about your expertise in the area of multiculturalism. Though the topic we have chosen today is of immense importance, that is on Islamophobia, what it is and does it even exist, I believe it's a very crucial thing to discuss at this current juncture of the time, especially the things which has been happening in the given condition in a country like India as well. So with that, a brief note, Dr. Amir Ali, I would like to invite you to express and please leave us with your valuable ideas and the things that you might want to talk today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, you're audible, sir.
Thank you, Imtiaz, for that very, very generous and very nice and very warm introduction. I hope I live up to the nice things that you said. So I will be speaking about Islamophobia and what exactly is the nature of the phenomenon. Does it even exist? And the reason why I took this title is because there's a great deal of denial of Islamophobia that it just doesn't exist at all. I will be linking it up with multiculturalism because there is a particular way in which my understanding of Islamophobia flows out from my earlier work on multiculturalism. So even though I don't work on it with that much frequency anymore, but I do kind of think that my current interests flow out of earlier work that I've done. The book that you mentioned, Imtiaz, is already out. It just came out a few months ago. So in fact, in that book, I have a whole chapter on Islamophobia that has arisen in a very nasty sort of a way in the UK, which is the focus of my book. So in many ways, I'll be linking up with work that I've recently done, writing that I have done recently, and also a lot of analysis that has been going on. So let me try to begin with the definition of Islamophobia, which is always a very difficult thing to define anything. So the courses that I teach here at JNU, one course that I teach is called Classical Political Philosophy, which at the best of times is a very difficult course to teach because we begin with a lot of Socrates. So some of you may be aware that Socrates was this very wise figure of Athens. He was made to drink the hemlock because of things that he said which people didn't like. And we all know that if you say things these days that people don't like, it can be a pretty dangerous and precarious situation. So that's something that happened to Socrates as well. The thing about Socrates was that he would always demand definitions from people. So he was someone who would be constantly found in the marketplace of Athens, his native Athens, and the Agora, as it was called. And youngsters would be drawn to him. There was a certain kind of appeal that he had towards youngsters. It's a bit like, I don't know, think of the way that youngsters are drawn to Shah Rukh Khan or Salman Khan or something of that kind. So he was something of a celebrity in Athens. Of course, not a film star, of course. And he was, from what we hear, very ugly to look at. But even then, there was this kind of attraction that he had. The reason why he had this attraction towards youngsters was because he would always ask people to define things that they thought they knew. And quite often when they try to put forward a definition of something, just give me a minute, my apologies, this phone was ringing. So every time he would ask people for an apology of things that they thought they were familiar with, they thought that they knew, most people would fail to do so, which in the Socratic method, as it's called, is known as the centrality of the definition. So in that vein, let me try to put forward a definition of Islamophobia. My own understanding of Islamophobia is that it flows out of the nation state. It is a form of hatred towards Muslims that emanates from the nation state itself. So the rubric that I take to understand Islamophobia is the rubric of the nation state. Why does this problem arise in terms of the Muslim vis-a-vis the nation state? The problem, in my understanding, arises because there is a certain element of suspicion and fear that the Muslim population of many nation states, not all of them, but nation states which are prone to what we call Islamophobia, are unlikely to be assimilated. And since they are unlikely to be assimilated, there is this kind of a suspicion towards them as being potential fifth columnists, that they could be subversive to the nation state. So what we have in terms of the definition that I'm putting forward is a definition of Muslims or the Muslim population presence as posing a problem within nation states in terms of their lack of assimilability. Now, having kind of talked about this very general kind of a discussion, you will notice that there are three elements of what I'm putting forward, the three elements of the definition. One is the nation state. The second is the lack of assimilability. And thirdly, the element of the Muslim presence being problematic within the nation state. So those are the three elements that I'm trying to put forward in terms of understanding Islamophobia as a phenomenon, which is, to my understanding, intrinsically linked to the nation state. Now, before I continue, if there's how much time do I have?
So you can take 1.5 hours, then we will have half an hour saved to have question and answers if you allow.
Okay, so I will speak for 1 hour, and then after that,
perfectly fine.
Okay. I will, as I said, I'll try to provoke as many questions as I can, because I always feel that it's always important to have questions and, of course, a dialogue, which is what this forum is all about. As I said, there are three elements of the definition that I've just put forward. Okay, let me just go over those three elements once again. There is the most crucial element, which is the nation state. Then secondly, the element of the lack of assimilability that is perceived to be the problem with the Muslim presence. And thirdly, the fact that this is a population presence that is understood to be existing within the nation state, and in some ways, by being within the nation state, is a potentially subversive fifth column, as we call it. That's broadly the way that I look at Islamophobia. Of course, there are aspects of these three elements that I will try to complicate as we go along. Now, in terms of trying to understand Islamophobia, I also link it very centrally with another form of hatred that many of you may be very familiar with, and that is anti-Semitism. Now, my own understanding of anti-Semitism flows very centrally from the famous political theorist Hannah Arendt, which many of you may be familiar with the writings of Hannah Arendt, herself of Jewish origin. And in many ways, if one reads her writings, one notices the very central element of a Jewish identity coming, kind of, in many ways, suffusing her theorization. But she is, without doubt, one of the most insightful of 20th century political theorists to read. The work of hers that I kind of rely on a lot to understand anti-Semitism is her 1951 book on the origins of totalitarianism, which is work that I think is very relevant with, in the times that we live in. It kind of seems to resonate in terms of the very, very dangerous situations that we find ourselves in. I'm sure that many of you will be following the news that is coming in from Ukraine. It is extremely worrying. Almost exactly 2 weeks ago, when the Russians decided to invade Ukraine, there was almost kind of a surreal feeling. We always thought that things like this don't happen in the 21st century, that these were things that happened in the 20th, perhaps centuries before that. But obviously, we are living in very strange times. And that kind of, the dread of totalitarianism that Arendt talks about is something that has not left us. It is still very much around us. So in order to kind of extend my understanding of Islamophobia, what I'm suggesting is that it's a form of hatred that is very similar to another form of hatred, the hatred of the Jews, which is referred to as anti-Semitism. In the next few minutes, I will try to make a further differentiation between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But the common factor in both these two forms of hatred is the nation state. The problematic category that I'm suggesting is the nation state itself. Now, we are all very familiar with what the nation state is. It is the most familiar form of political organization that we know today. We live in a world of nation states. There's the United Nations, which is has been thrown into frenzied deliberations because of the crisis in Ukraine. In many ways, the Russian expansion can be understood as a form of Russian nationalism, and therefore the broader point that I'm trying to make here is that when I'm trying to kind of understand, in this conjoint analysis, as I call it, okay, an analysis where I'm conjoining Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, what conjoins these two forms of hatred is the vital connecting element of the nation state itself. Okay, so I hope those points are clear. If there's something which is unclear, please do feel free to stop me in, and I can say this once again. I also have a very bad habit of speaking very fast, which I can't seem to help. And there are reasons for that. Perhaps if time permits, I'll tell you. But what exactly did Hannah Arendt write in this 1951 work of hers on the origins of totalitarianism? The point that Arendt made was that if one wants to understand the hatred of the Jew, one has to go back to the setting of Central and Eastern Europe of the mid to the late 19th century, where increasingly the Jewish population presence was becoming very, very problematic. Now, the reason why it was becoming very problematic was because the Jewish presence was considered to be problematic vis-a-vis the nation state. Again, as you can see, the nation state becoming very, very important here. It was problematic vis-a-vis the nation state because it was felt that the Jews had this anomalous position between nation states. Again, the point that I'm making and asking all of you to think about is that the problem of the Jewish population presence is perceived from the framework through the conceptual rubric of the nation state. The difference that I'm trying to point out between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is that when it came to anti-Semitism in the 19th century, the Jewish population presence was perceived as being problematic because of its anomalous positioning between nation states. The point that I made about Islamophobia at the very beginning when I tried to put forward a definition was that problem arises from the Muslim population presence and its existence within the nation state. So the crucial distinction that I'm trying to make here is that although there are great similarities between these two forms of hatred, the one difference that I'm trying to point out is the difference of between and within. So when I talk about anti-Semitism as a form of hatred towards Jews, that hatred is arising from the difficult positioning of Jews between nation states. Okay? When I talk about Islamophobia, I'm talking about the problem of Muslims and the problem of this perceived problem. It is a perceived problem because the problem actually doesn't exist. That's the point about a phobia. I mean, many people phobias, for example, claustrophobia. That's a form of phobia that I sometimes kind of experience. When I'm in a lift alone, I'm fearful of the closed space of a lift. The point about a phobia is that it's irrational, unfounded fear, which actually tells you more about the person who's experiencing the fear rather than from where the fear is stemming from. So in terms of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, there is an irrationality to it. What it suggests is, it tells you more about the people who are experiencing the hatred rather than the object of the hatred itself. So all manner of stereotypes are made about Jews. For example, the bad Jews and the Jews were these great plotters and the ideas of the protocol of the elders of Zion. All of this prejudice, as I keep saying, is more reflective of the people who are experiencing the hate rather than the object of hatred itself. Now, similar can be the case of Muslims. I'll go into various manifestations of what constitutes Islamophobia. Perhaps that will be my next point, but I'll make that next point after I've cleared up some of these points, conceptual points that I'm making. So just to kind of quickly reiterate, My point, which I'm asking all of you to think about, is that a hatred of this kind is reflective more of the perceptions of the people who are doing the hatred, experiencing the hatred, rather than the object of hatred. So ideas of Muslims being terrorists, for example, may not have an objective reality, but this is something that has been firmly lodged in people's minds to such an extent that most people will fail to realize that there are other forms of terrorism. So I think when I consider something like Islamophobia and this idea that Muslims are subversive population presences, in recent times, especially in the last 20 years since the September 11th incidents in New York, 9/11 incidents as they're referred to, this I think is the most palpable manifest form of Islamophobia, the idea that, well, all Muslims may not be terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. So just to give an example of this, I remember giving a talk some years ago where the audience seemed to have got it into their heads that the only terrorism that you have is Islamic terrorism. So in order to kind of try to dislodge this particular impression, which I thought is a completely false impression and a very unfair impression, what I asked people was if they had heard of terrorist organizations like the Japanese Red Army or the Lord's Salvation Army or the Tupac Amaru or the Sendero Luminoso or the Bader Meinhof gang. And most people didn't seem to have a clue about such terrorist organizations. And that was the point that I made. The point that I made was that the larger media presence is such that it constantly bombards people with this unfounded idea that only Muslims are terrorists, neglecting the many, many other terrorist organizations that exist. So in terms of what I call the most palpable manifestation of Islamophobia that one can find all around, which is completely, to my mind, misconceived and unfair and unfounded, this would be an example. Now, again, what I'm urging all of you to do is to go back to the point that I made at the very beginning in terms of trying to prefer a definition. My point was that Islamophobia is the fear of Muslims as subversive population presences within the nation state. Okay, so Muslims acting as sleeper cells. These are the terms that have become very, very kind of commonplace in the aftermath of the war against terror. So as you can see, this is the way that I'm trying to kind of push forward this discussion. Now, again, in some of the talks that I've given on this particular theme, a question that I've asked people is how serious a threat do they think that terrorism is? And most people will tell me, well, they think that it's one of the most serious threats. And then I ask them the question, do you think that it's as serious as, let's say, climate change? And because the effects of climate change are not as palpable as the perceived presence of Islamic terrorism, people say no, they feel much, much more threatened by it. So I give them a statistic. Not that I'm a great fan of statistics. Whenever I think of statistics and numbers and number crunching, I'm reminded of what the great American humorist Mark Twain is famously known to have said. He said there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. But not to deny that statistics are completely irrelevant. One of the statistics that I often put forward to people is, the question that I've asked people is, how potent a threat do you think terrorism is? And they will tell me, well, it's all around you. Look at September 11th and look at Sri Lanka, the Easter bombings and all of that, right? I mean, the incidents in India. And then I asked them if they've heard about Sridevi. And they said, of course, if they've heard about Sridevi, the actress who died tragically some 3 years ago. And I asked them, well, do you remember how she died? And, from the reports that we get is that she apparently slipped in her bathtub and died. Now, that is a very rare form of dying. I mean, to actually slip in one's own bathtub and drown in it. The statistical possibilities of that are pretty rare. Now, it's hard to believe that the statistical possibilities of dying in a terrorist attack are as rare as that. I mean, you're more likely to die in a car accident or something of that kind than this. Now, the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is to kind of point out to the kind of media bombardment that has driven into people's minds this notion that only Muslims are terrorists and terrorism is the major problem in the world, when actually it isn't. Okay, this perception has been created by the war on terror. which the Australian journalist John Pilger has recently referred to as a completely fraudulent war. Nothing came out of it. It did not end the problem of terrorism. I'm not denying that terrorism doesn't exist. All that I'm saying is that the problem has been scaled up kind of in such an exaggerated sort of a way to give most people the impression that this is the major problem. Okay, now my point really is that when I'm trying to think about Islamophobia, this is the form of Islamophobia that most often people have. I mean, this is the most palpable form that it takes. To counter this, I mean, it's difficult to counter things that the media bombards with people. I mean, I think that the media is perhaps actually has become a bit of a problem, so certainly social media. The next point that I've often made, quite often, and since this is, a small set of people and you're all students and you'll be very aware of all these things. So I'm kind of trying to bring up things that can become the basis of the Q&A that we have after this. So one thing that I've asked people is if they've heard of the definition of terrorism, the Oxford English Dictionary in 1948. Remember, 1948 is the year of the creation of the State of Israel. Okay. 15th of May 1948, when the British mandate expired and the State of Israel was created, and the dispossession of the Palestinians, the Nakba as the Palestinians refer to it, began. Now, if one goes to the definition of terrorism in 1948, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, the example that has been taken is not the Palestinian, but the example of the terrorist that has been given is the Zionist of Palestine. Now that shows you how there has been a complete kind of a reversal of the larger popular perception of the terrorist. And to my understanding, that is because of this larger pervasive presence of Islamophobia. Okay, now let me go back. I think around 10 minutes ago, I suggested that I do a conjoint analysis of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism when I suggest that they are very similar forms of hatred. The similarity in terms of the way that the Jew is perceived and the way in which the Muslims are perceived. Now, the most tragic outcome of anti-Semitism, we all know, was the Nazi Holocaust, the final solution beginning in 1939 and ending in 1945 with the fall of the Third Reich, the Hitler regime. Now, this is what hatred can do. Hatred is not something that doesn't have consequences. If one wants to understand the consequence of hatred, one needs to understand the way that it unfolds. Okay, so the labeling of Jews, for example, throughout the late 19th century, it culminated in something of this kind. Now, by the most conservative estimate, something like 6 million Jews died in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Okay, now I'm sure that people will have watched movies and read books on this extremely horrific episode in modern history. The strange thing about the Nazi Holocaust, and again, this is a point that Hannah Arendt makes, is that, well, people went about their daily lives in Nazi Germany. They went about it as if no great crime was happening, when actually at that time, the most unspeakable of crimes was happening as they went about their daily jobs. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us it is very important for people to stand up and condemn hatred and say that it's wrong. Most of the time, people don't do that. It reminds one of the phrase that Hannah Arendt uses in another very famous work of hers, the book that she wrote of the Eichmann trials, Eichmann in Jerusalem, that very, very famous phrase, the banality of evil. Okay, how evil is so all-pervasive. It surrounds us, it encompasses us in such a way that it almost imperceptibly gets under our skins. And even if we deny it, the very denial of the hatred is a form of affirmation. Okay, people say, well, I have Muslim friends. When you accuse them of communalism, they'll say, oh, I have Muslim friends. Or if you accuse someone of being a racist, they'll say, well, blacks are my best friends. It's not enough to do that. It's also important to understand that there's a certain kind of a structural reinforcement of these forms of hatred. So when it comes to racism, for example, in the US and the UK, people have talked about structural reinforcement of these hatreds. It exists in the very institutions of society. So what makes something like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism so potent is not that these are casual attitudes that are held by people, but that these casual attitudes actually kind of resonate and reflect from the larger structuring of society. Okay, so what we have is the consequence of hate. Operation Finale, someone has said yes about I mean, I have watched the movie, and it's a very dramatic kind of a reenactment of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, and how it was able to pick up Eichmann from Buenos Aires in 1961, and it was led by the famous spy Rafi Aitan. When I was 18, 19, 20, I would read a lot of spy novels. For some reason, I'd be fascinated by it. So Frederick Forsyth, for example, and these other novelists. So let me come back. What I'm kind of trying to really bring up here is that hatred has consequences. Hatred is not just casual attitude that people have or a casual remark that people make. So, in America, people being called niggers, for example, or tacky bashing is being called in the UK, where people are referred to casually, with derisive terms, or in India, the way that Muslims and Dalits are being looked at. So what we have here is the point about hatred that I'm making is that most immediately it's held by people, but it's not just about a casual holding of a hate. That casual holding of a hate is a reflection of the institution of that society. And if I go back to the point that I made at the very beginning, it resonates from the most significant political structure, which is the nation state itself. That is where the hatred is coming from. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the nation state is an entity that is extremely homogenizing in terms of its effects. Now, we're seeing the effects of that in India right now, Hindutva nationalism, in terms of its trying to define nationalism. Okay, essentially what is happening is that an earlier, more capacious notion of civic nationalism is now being replaced by a cultural nationalism. The point that Hamid Ansari, the former vice president, made, and I thought which was a very valid point to make. And look at the kind of hatred that was directed towards someone as eminent and as respectable as Hamid Ansari. The way that people would talk about him as a ghettoized Muslim figure, which he clearly isn't. Okay, in the articles that I read, especially in First Post, for example, he would be derisively referred to as someone who mainly represented India and Saudi Arabia, who was the vice chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University. So the Muslim identity was brought up, forgetting the fact that he was India's permanent representative at the UN in the 1990s, in where he played a pretty crucial role. Now, again, this would be an example of Islamophobia. The way that people talked about Hamid Ansari, the way that he was derided, the way that his scholarship was questioned. He is. I mean, I have had the wonderful opportunity of meeting him twice. Once in Jamia, actually, when I used to teach there. And the man is someone who is extremely refined, who has of course he is a diplomat, and of course the way he speaks, diplomats are supposed to speak in a particular sort of a way. But look at the way that he's being portrayed. Okay, the portrayal was in terms of a stereotypical Muslim portrayal, a fanatical person. Again, that would be an example of the Islamophobia portraying people in a certain sort of a way. All right. So time and time again, a lot of what I've been saying is hinging and circulating around the nation state. Okay, the notion of the nation state being a homogenizing entity. Now, why do I say this? I'm going to make 2 points now. Okay, 2 slightly historical points, which I would ask you to bear with me as I make these points. Now, when I talked about especially anti-Semitism, I suggested that, drawing from Hannah Arendt, I suggested that it's a Central and Eastern European setting where it begins in the late 19th century. Okay? It arises from the nation state and its relationship with the Jewish population presences. Now, if one looks at the history of the nation state, quite often people would say that it all goes back to 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, political science students. How many, can I just ask people what backgrounds they are, so that I get a fair sense of, the people that I'm talking to. So Imtiaz, you're the only person I can see. So can I begin with you?
Yeah, sure, sir. I'm currently a doctoral candidate at the Department of Political Science, Jamia. So yes, I have a background in it.
Political science, my former department. What about other people? Can I just ask them?
Yeah, sure. If likely people want to respond, they're most welcome. But whereas I believe it's quite interdisciplinary in nature, People
Okay.
are coming from political science, sociology, economics, and various sort of backgrounds. So, but
Okay.
they are pretty familiar as this course has been going for quite
Okay.
long. So they're
Yeah.
quite familiar with all these terminologies. And
Okay. Okay. So I mean, I'm not making points which are completely, I'm sure that there must be some kind of resonance. It is resonating with itself. Okay. So, in terms of the historical origins of the nation state, people often talk about 1648 Westphalia. But of late, especially through the works of the Ugandan political scientist Mahmoud Mamdani, whose book I read last year, Neither Settler Nor Native, the point that Mamdani is making is that actually you've got to move it back 150 years and perhaps move 2,000 kilometers to the south and the west, where one reaches the Iberian Peninsula. And the origins of the nation state actually have to do with the Iberian Peninsula. And the year is 1492, the year in which the Reconquista, the Spanish Reconquista, is able to bring about the fall of the Moors and the Moorish presence on the Iberian Peninsula. So those stories that people may have heard about Granada and Alhambra and Andalusia, that is where actually the nation state and its origins lie. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the Spanish Reconquista, it created a very perverse form of political monotheism. Now, we're all familiar with monotheism as in Islam and Christianity and Judaism being monotheistic religions. I'm not talking about religious monotheism or theological monotheism. I'm talking about a political monotheism. Now, the point about the nation state is it is a form of political monotheism. It demands a certain worshipping exclusively at the altar of the nation state. Now, the best capturing of this, what I'm calling this political monotheism, is a slogan that actually comes from 16th century absolutist France. Une loi, une foi, un roi. Okay, sorry, forgive me my French. I tried learning French many, many years ago. Never got very far, but it is one of the most mellifluous languages to listen to in terms of its nasalizations. And I wish I'd got a little further in trying to learn French, but I gave up the idea. There are two languages that I've always enjoyed listening to for its mellifluous, the quality of the sound. One is Bengali. I love the kind of roly-poly way that Bengali is spoken. Ghalib is once known to have said on his travels to Bengal that it's like someone is speaking with two rosogollas on both sides of the mouth. And the other is French, which is a remarkable language in terms of its what I call its mellifluous quality. Now, as I said, this point about political monotheism that I'm making is captured in that 16th century absolutist French slogan, une loi, une foi, un roi, which means one law, one rule, one king. And you can see the monotheism in terms of this. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to go back to 1492. Okay. I'll just keep track of the time because, as I said, I would want to have as much discussion as possible. Why is 1492 so significant? 1492 is so significant because you have three monotheistic religions battling it out with each other. There is a Spanish Reconquista, which is pretty much Christianity. Then there is Islam and Judaism, which are going to be persecuted on the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, the Iberian Peninsula is that geographical region west of the Pyrenees mountain range, which now constitutes Spain and Portugal. Okay, now the most remarkable story that I have read of 1492 goes like this. Okay, and I'm going to tell this story, and perhaps people will be familiar with this story. So the Moorish ruler who had been defeated was called Muhammad III. And when a ruler is defeated, what the ruler has to do is to leave his capital. Okay, and as Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile were victorious, Muhammad III, the Moorish ruler, had to leave his famous palace of Alhambra. And the story goes like this. It's probably apocryphal, but even then, perhaps it's the apocryphal stories which are perhaps the most interesting to listen to in terms of history. So apparently, when he's leaving the Alhambra palace, along with his retinue, there is a certain point where you can turn back and you can see the whole of the palace, right? So when you've traveled a certain distance, there's a certain point you can can look at the whole palace. So at a particular point on a certain rock, Muhammad III is known to have turned back to look at his palace for one last time. It's all very kind of teary and feelings of nostalgia and all of that. So when he turned back, he sighed and he broke into tears. Okay? That rock in Spanish is referred to as El Ulto del Moro del Suspiro, which means the Moor's last sigh, which of course is a novel. It's a title of Salman Rushdie's 1995 novel that was written after the more controversial satanic verses. Now, again, that's 1492 for you. In terms of how significant 1492 is, just to kind of underline the significance of 1492, the man who is going to discover the new world, Christopher Columbus, was there in the year 1492 to witness this particular event. It is this particular event which gives him the commission to go and discover the new world. So he went, of course, to find India. He was through one of the great acts of serendipity. He didn't find India, but he certainly found the island of Hispaniola, and of course, the Americas as they are referred to. Okay, so this is what we have. Okay, this is the nation state for you. This is the origin of the nation state. An entity that is extremely problematic, and most importantly, its worst instincts lead to a certain kind of genocidal impulse. That's the problem with the nation state. If it is not tempered, if it is not subjected to a certain kind of attenuating of its worst impulses. So what we have then is the nation state in terms of exhibiting its worst impulses on a genocidal scale. That's what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany. It was German nationalism. Okay, the ideas of the Nazi ideology, which resulted in the idea that the Jews have to be exterminated, the ideas of racial hygiene. Something similar we can see happening in India right now. Okay, Gregory Stanton's Genocide Watch report makes for chilling reading, because this is something that Stanton has been saying for quite some time, because he has a 10-point scale of genocide. And he says that India now is on scale 9, which is kind of impending outbreak of violence. So again, this reinforces my point. Hatred has consequences. It has consequences at 3 levels. Those 3 levels are the level of individuals expressing hatred, that hatred being reinforced in terms of the wider societal institutions and structure of society, and at the highest level of the very institutional structure of the nation state itself. Which is why, at the very beginning, I spent so much time suggesting that if one wants to understand Islamophobia, it is important to understand Islamophobia in terms of its relationship with the nation state, and not just Islamophobia, but also anti-Semitism as well. Okay? So there's a certain kind of a large, broad historical sweep that I've tried to give to the understanding of Islamophobia as a particular form of hatred that arises from within the conceptual rubric of the nation state. And that conceptual rubric I've tried to explain with a kind of a larger historical sweep. Okay, I'm going to come to more recent times now. Okay, I'm going to suggest that however similar these two phenomena may be, these two forms of hatred may be, there is a certain kind of a time lag between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Okay, so Islamophobia is a much, much more recent phenomenon. And since it is a much more recent phenomenon, the attempts to conceptualize and define it have not been as effective as the attempts to conceptualize and define anti-Semitism. Okay, so it's younger. It's much younger. It's of more recent origin. And in order to kind of understand this kind of a time lag, I'm going to take 2 events, almost 100 years apart, which explain the way in which these 2 forms of hatred have been perpetrated across the world. So the first incident I'm going to take is 1894, the famous Dreyfus affair in the Third Republic of France. Okay, now I can't recall all the details, but Captain Dreyfus was of Jewish origin, a captain in the French army who was accused of treason because of his Jewish origin. Okay, so that's the Dreyfus affair. The implications of the Dreyfus affair do not remain confined to 1894, but extend well into the 20th century. Okay, that's the Dreyfus affair for you. It is an event of remarkably far-reaching political implications. in terms of how the hatred of the Jew was being manifest. Okay, I'm going to jump almost 100 years. I'm going to come to the year 1989. That's roughly just a little less than 100 years. The event is around the publication of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, and the Muslim response to it, which is, of course, I don't agree with at all. The idea that a writer must be beheaded. But the point that I do want to make is that the Rushdie affair, despite its very heroic putting up of a certain kind of principled position on free speech, resulted in a certain manifold multiplication of Islamophobia. So this is how I would look at the Rushdie affair. That, despite its proclaimed intention of wanting to protect free speech, what it actually did was it created or gave rise to a vast amount of hatred towards the Muslim. So the idea that Muslims can never accept a principle like free speech, I would think, would be a manifestation of Islamophobia. Okay, this is the point I'm making. So in terms of the way that I'm trying to kind of push the analysis now, I'm taking two events almost 100 years apart. Well, a little less than that, perhaps 95 years apart. Okay, the 1894 Dreyfus affair. And I'm suggesting that the Dreyfus affair is the event which gives rise to a certain kind of palpable presence of anti-Semitism in many European societies. From what I remember of the Dreyfus affair, and again, these points I'm getting from Hannah Arendt herself, Arendt suggests that the Dreyfus affair had far-reaching implications that went very, very far into the 20th century. Okay? Similarly, when it comes to the Rushdie affair, what I'm suggesting is that the Rushdie affair is perhaps the trigger that really gave rise to the kind of very high levels of Islamophobia that we are witnessing in many, many societies across the world. Of course, when the Rushdie affair broke out, of course, we were the first country to ban it. India was the first country to ban it. It played out very dramatically in the UK, where the book was burnt in the city of Bradford in, I think, January 1989. And of course, the fatwa that was issued against Salman Rushdie on February the 14th, which was Valentine's Day in 1989. Interestingly, not many people in India knew about Valentine's Day in those days. But by the time we got into the 1990s, the more kind of liberalized India, Valentine's Day became this thing that almost everyone, even in the smaller towns and provinces, had become very aware of. But this is the way I'm looking at what I call the time lag between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Okay, now having made that point, the next point that I would want to make is that, just give me a minute, I just kind of get back the thread of my argument. I mean, I'm just so caught up in the Rushdie affair. I've written about it so many times, that I was getting caught up in the details of the Rushdie affair itself. Okay, to kind of push forward the idea. In terms of the recency of Islamophobia, the fact that it's much more recent compared to anti-Semitism, there is what I can call an Islamophobia denial. Now, this happens especially in many European countries, the denial that there is such a thing as Islamophobia. Now, just to kind of underline this, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Canadian alt-right thinker, Jordan Peterson, very controversial figure. Now, I don't have Peterson's quote in front of me, but I can kind of recall the substance of the quote, where basically he says that it's a false idea. He says there's no such thing as Islamophobia. It's an idea that he believes is deployed by morons to fool people. I mean, that's how strong a position that he's taking against Islamophobia. Now, there are all manner of people who will engage in what is called Islamophobia denial. I mean, I can think of people like Richard Dawkins, for example, I mean, the famous scientist. That's where you kind of, that's where it all comes from. Why is it denied? Well, it's denied because of a very simple categorical quibble. Okay, the categorical quibble is that while the Jews constitute a race, Muslims don't constitute a race. And since this is a form of racism, Islamophobia cannot be, there's no such thing as Islamophobia. Okay, so let me just say this once again. So while anti-Semitism is an established category of racism, there is Islamophobia denial. Now, what I'm suggesting is that Islamophobia denial happens on the basis of what I call a conceptual quibble. Quibble, Q-U-I-B-B-L-E. What is the quibble? The quibble is Well, the Jews constitute a racial group. Muslims are a faith group coming from different races. And since they don't constitute one single race, therefore, there is no such thing as Islamophobia because the phenomenon doesn't exist. Now, this is a very ingenious kind of a denial of it all, for the simple reason that we know, anyone who's read anything about racism knows, that racism in the 20th century itself has transformed itself from an earlier biological racism to a much more recent cultural racism. This is what many people who are, talk about racism refer to as new racism. Okay, so once again, I try to bring up what I call the conceptual quibble. What I'm also suggesting is that in this lag, this earlier anti-Semitism and this later Islamophobia, what it also brings up is the transformation in the very nature of racism itself, the transformation from an earlier biological racism to a more recent manifestation of racism in the form of cultural racism. Okay, now what does this cultural racism do? Well, the cultural racism is coded through the nation state itself. This is a point that I'm making on the basis of one of my favorite books, which has really helped me in at least some of my recent writings. And this is a book by the sociologist. The book is called "There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack." Okay, Paul Gilroy. So, Behzad, if you remember, the lecture that I gave last year was based. The title of my lecture was based on that book. So, the title of my lecture that I gave last year, Behzad asked me, was "There Ain't No Black in Brexit," and it comes from the title of this work, Paul Gilroy. Now, essentially, that's the point that Gilroy is making. Gilroy is basically suggesting that the new race, this new cultural form of racism, is a form of racism that gets reinforced through the structures of the nation state, which means that this particular form of hatred is actually layered, steeped into the nation state itself. And therefore, the point that I've been trying to make a number of times, it is from that particular highest level of political organization that hatreds like this are manifesting themselves. Okay? Now, this, in many ways, I mean, it doesn't become a problem until as recently as, let's say, the last 10, 12 years. Because nation states did not bring out their worst instincts as they have been doing in the last few years. I mean, our own independence movement defined India in what can be called civic nationalist terms. Of late, what has happened is that there has been a narrower ambit of nationalism in terms of cultural nationalism. And I think this is perhaps one of the great transformations that has happened in nationalism. Now, when this transformation happens, that means that the ambit or the bandwidth of nationalism narrows. And by the narrowing of the bandwidth of nationalism, there are some people who are likely to be left out of the pale. Those people who are left out of the pale will then be subjected to various forms of hatred. So, I mean, we're waiting with bated breath for the UP election results tomorrow. No one knows what's going to happen. At least I don't think anyone can predict. From my own experience, exit polls are notoriously unreliable. But the statement that Yogi Adityanath made about 80-20 is a blatant form of Islamophobia. I mean, everyone knows what he was talking about. I mean, we all know that he was talking about the difference in the population of Muslims and Hindus. That is what he was kind of talking about. But this is the point about Islamophobia. It becomes much, much more blatant in terms of the narrowing of the bandwidth of nationalism. The point that Hamid Ansari was making in that speech that he gave towards the end of January to the India-America Muslim Council. Okay, he was talking about the transformation from a civic nationalism to a cultural nationalism. Now, once again, my point really is that when it comes to a hatred like Islamophobia, it is arising from certain transformations of the nation state itself. When the nation state experiences a narrowing of the bandwidth of nationalism from an earlier civic to a more narrower cultural variety, hatred of this kind will become much, much more palpable and manifest. Now, Imtiaz, you referred to my book, which has just come out. I'll just say a few things about that because a lot of what I'm saying is actually based on a chapter in that book that I have on Islamophobia, where I make this conjoint analysis between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and then I'll stop and then I'll take as many questions as possible. Now, I followed the Brexit debates very, very closely because I was looking at Brexit as a global kind of a phenomenon. I mean, I wasn't looking at as just a UK phenomenon. And what really kind of worried me about the reports on Brexit in India were that it was an event of global significance that largely went missing. I mean, there were not many people who were seemed to be very interested. Just to give you an example of this, why I'm saying this is that when I was researching the book, I was very surprised to know that in 2016, which is the year that Brexit happens, also the year in which Trump won the presidential victory in America, the coverage in the Chinese media of Brexit exceeded the coverage of the Trump presidency. That's very strange because we normally think of the UK as a country which is past its prime, which is no longer that important, whose significance is declining. And I would agree with that because I think Brexit itself is a manifestation of the declining influence of the UK. When if you look at the Ukraine crisis right now, the countries that are at the forefront in Europe are Germany and France. And UK is kind of trying to tag along. The point about the UK was that it was always significant because it acted as a bridgehead or a conduit between Europe and the US. That was why it continued to play a very, very significant role. But just to say a few things about Brexit. Brexit emerged from a narrow English nationalism, not Scottish, not Welsh, not Irish. It was all a manifestation of a narrow, racist English nationalism. Okay, the Scots, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, has been saying that since Brexit has happened, they might secede from the UK, which would mean the breakup of Britain. That's the title of a book actually written in 1977 by the theorist Tom Nairn. So that was what Brexit was all about. The other thing that Brexit has done is it has given rise to tremendous levels of both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. If you've been following the news, there's many accusations of anti-Semitism have been leveled at especially the British Labour Party led by the socialist leader Jeremy Corbyn. Okay. Similarly, allegations of Islamophobia have been leveled against the Conservative Party and specifically at the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, in his case, the allegations that were leveled against him were that he wrote about Muslim women who decided to wear burqas as looking like letterboxes and bank robbers. That's what he said in one of his Daily Telegraph columns. He has a very colorful kind of language that he uses in his writing, and his speeches. He's a bit of a buffoon, actually. He's a bit of a clown who tries to act like Churchill. That Churchill is his hero. But what I'm bringing up here is that most recently in Brexit, what we have seen is these two forms of hatred suddenly re-emerging with a certain kind of vehemence in British society. Okay, located in different sites, different political sites. When it came to anti-Semitism, it was the British Labour Party that was experiencing high levels of anti-Semitism. Whereas when it came to Islamophobia, this form of hatred was being experienced in the Conservative Party. And I've given two examples of the British Prime Minister. Now, as I said, this will be my last 2 points, and I'll wind it up. What this signaled was the complete failure of British multiculturalism. Okay, British multiculturalism was this superficial attempt to contain but not counter racism. Now, there's a difference between containing and countering. When you contain something, you just put it in a bottle, okay? Put it on a corner. But that doesn't make the thing go away. It just confines and contains the problem. At some point, the problem can break out, as it has broken out in Britain recently, in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. Okay, so my point about multiculturalism is that it is a superficial policy measure that is not able to counter racism, but merely contains it. So the vital distinction that I'm making is between countering and containing. To counter racism, one needs far more, more effective, far-reaching measures. So there was a certain superficiality in British multiculturalism. Okay, I'm going to use an analogy now, which will be my last point. This is the analogy of a bottle. You've seen a bottle. I'm sure you've seen a bottle, right? Now, you can put something in a bottle. Okay, that is exactly what British multiculturalism did. It put racism into a bottle. Okay, and to continue the analogy, I'm sure you've heard that story about genies escaping from bottles. Okay, when they escape, they give you three wishes. I think that is what Brexit was all about. It was the genie of racism escaping from the bottle of British multiculturalism that merely contained but never counted racism, which has now manifested itself in these two forms. One last point that I quickly want to make, and this is again crucial in terms of the distinctions that I've been trying to make. In terms of my understanding of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and this holds true for Britain, it may not hold for other countries. But what I would suggest is that electorally, anti-Semitism doesn't work for a political party. That may be because of the older, the more, the more dated nature of anti-Semitism. It certainly works for many political parties when it comes to electoral victory. So it worked brilliantly for the Conservatives. That is why the BJP keeps raising the issue of Muslims and the Islamophobic comments that it keeps making. You could find this in Myanmar, for example. I mean, the way that the NLD, for example, never criticized the persecution of the Rohingya. So my last point is that in terms of the distinction that I'm trying to make, what the strange, anomalous thing that one notices is that anti-Semitism doesn't really work electorally. Islamophobia does. And this distinction, I think, happens because of anti-Semitism being an older phenomenon and Islamophobia being a much, much more recent phenomenon. So I'm going to end there. And if there are questions, I'd be very happy to answer those questions.
Thank you so much, sir. This is not being able to express myself that how well it was actually in my words, but obviously it was very well acquainted, proficient, and we are well aware that how well versed you are in your knowledge and giving the lectures. So thank you for portraying the trajectory for us, especially in context of nation state, that how proficiently you have taken us back from the conventional idea of Westphalia to back to the Andalusia and Reconquista of French. And certainly we believe that the French saying you have said, one law, one rule, and one king, which is likely taking all over the world instead of being in a very democratic setup that we are following all over the world. So there's been too many things eventually that's also popping up in my mind, but eventually I will allow the students who are present over here, if they are willing to ask anything. They're most welcome, any one of you.
Hi.
Yes, Pragya, please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is that while we've heard a lot in terms of the process and understanding Islamophobia. I think my mind, I was kind of trying to look more for solutions, and the only thing I came across was you mentioning that hatred needs to be countered by every person at every opportunity. So are there any other solutions, either let's say state-wise, maybe if let's say a new party comes electorally on power, or than the one promoting Islamophobia, or in general at the civil society level or individual level that you could recommend in terms of solutions?
Pragya, I'm sorry, I don't have a solution, but let me try to kind of say something that might move towards a solution. I mean, to be absolutely honest with you, Pragya, I am bewildered by the current circumstances. I mean, I don't think that I have in my own lifetime experienced anything as bleak as what we are going through right now. And I'm not saying this to sound dramatic or apocalyptic. Things are really bad right now in the world. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, has underlined how bad things are. So, yes, I mean, solutions will emerge. I am looking at the present conjuncture as all of us, and I mean all of us, being on the cusp of a major global transformation. I mean, this is something that has been happening for the last 10, 15 years now. I would go back 20 years, the 2001 war against terror, which, I mean, I quoted John Pilger to say there was a complete fraud. It was nothing about countering terrorism. The 2007 global financial crisis, which I think has given rise to vast levels of inequality across the world. 4 years after that, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. And then this decade, the 2010s that has gone by, has been a very turbulent decade. So solutions will emerge, but they will not emerge in the form of technocratic solutions, the ones that engineers provide. There will be solutions that emerge from people being able to understand the lineaments of the new world order that is emerging. That is how I think solutions will emerge. And I think what that requires is a certain kind of clairvoyance and foresight and a certain intelligence that is able to kind of presciently understand what the future holds for all of us. So often I feel the language of social sciences fails in its ability to convey a world order that is about to be born, because we don't know what it's going to look like. Okay, so I often then take recourse to the language of poetry. And I'm reminded of the lines of Iqbal. I'll just go to these lines and explain this in English for people who may not know the Urdu so well. So Iqbal says that Alame no hai abhi parda-e taqdeer mein. Alame no means a new world. Abhi hai parda-e taqdeer parda, it is behind the veil of fate. Meri nigahoon mein iski seher hai behijab. But in my eyes, I've been able to understand what it may look like. And I think when it comes to solutions, it requires that kind of intelligence to be able to understand what the future may look like, and most importantly, what we want it to look like. And therefore, I make this point that it's important for every single one of us to look at the hatreds that exist in all of us. I mean, no one is free of hatred, right? There's this kind of a self-righteous feeling that, okay, some of us are less prejudiced than the others. And I think it's important to rehabilitate prejudice. And the reason why I'm saying this, Pragya, is because the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer has said something very interesting about prejudice. Normally, when we think of the word prejudice, we think of it as having something having a negative connotation. Actually, prejudice, all that it means is prejudgment. When you don't know about something, you have a prejudgment, right? So before I came to JNU, I had some kind of a vague idea of JNU kaisa hoga. All right? And I think this is really the problem of hatred like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and all the other hatreds that exist. It is all about people prejudging others, not knowing what the other looks like. And therefore, the solution will really be for every one of us to be able to kind of genuinely try to understand the other as a human being. I think that would be the only solution. It's not even a solution. It's actually something of a wish list, actually. So I'm sorry, I don't have a solution.
Thank you. No problem. Thank you for your answer. We look for it together, whole cohort, maybe.
Yes, we will find a solution together, I'm sure. The world will come together. I'm a great optimist in that regard.
Yes, George, you can go ahead. Please ask your question.
Sir, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed different elements that you have brought on the particular topic. My question is on media infusing Islamophobia into the minds of people. You know, the villains of films, mostly they have name as Ali, Muhammad, or Antony.
Yeah.
The heroes are mostly from the nation state. So that itself, media plays a vital role infusing in the minds of people that these people are like villains. They are destroying the nation.
Yeah.
So I don't know what kind of a counter notion that we can give against such type of infusion of media into the minds of people on Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you. That's a very interesting observation. I mean, I can say two things about this. Firstly, is a book that Edward Said wrote back in 1984. I think 6 years after he wrote his most famous work, which of course was Orientalism. And I think in 1984, Said wrote the book Covering Islam, where he basically was able to bring out the manner in which, especially Western media outlets, for example, the BBC, for example, and the others, were portraying lands of Islam. And what this does is it reinforces in people's minds the idea that only Muslims are terrorists. So that's one thing in terms of this infusing of Islamophobia. You talked about movies. So I think some 23 years ago, there was a movie in which Nasruddin Shah starred. Amir Khan was also one of the stars in the movie. It was called Sarfarosh. Now, I watched that movie with great interest because it had some absolutely wonderful ghazals, which were very, very nice to listen to. But then the remarkable thing that I found in that movie was that the portrayal of the terrorist was very strange. And you're right that, the larger popular culture reinforces this idea that only some people are terrorists. Now, I have perhaps one simple thing to say, and that is that the problem has been made worse by the intrusion or the inroads of social media. Because what social media has done is that it has fragmented the possibility of reason in the public sphere. I mean, that's the point that the famous German theorist Jürgen Habermas made in his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. So in the Habermasian public sphere was a sphere of reason, where arguments entered on the basis of reason. The problem we now have is a completely uncontrollable social media sphere, where reason doesn't exist, but people live in what are referred to as their echo chambers. So it is the complete obliteration of reason. And I think, it goes back to the point that Pragya was making about solutions. I think one solution that we will all have to come up with is how we can bring reason back into the public sphere. Because there is a strange reign of unreason, of a complete irrationality, which prevails, which gives rise to, let's say, Brexit itself, or to leaders like Donald Trump, and to the populism that we see across the world right now. So I think the major challenge is another understanding of reason, which is vital and vigorous to be able to contend with this. And when I make that point, I'm at a loss as far as solutions are concerned, because I often think that reason on its own stands no chance when it confronts irrationality, and therefore a different conceptualization of reason would be required. A conceptualization of reason where reason doesn't stand in solid, in isolation, but is able to kind of associate itself with positive emotions, an emotive reason, if I can put it like that. Because the way that reason has been conceptualized is, as I said, in terms of its standalone nature, reason standing apart. And this gives rise to the possibility of lots of other things arraying itself against reason. So perhaps a reason that is able to incorporate the positive passions, would be the only way that I could answer this question, George. But again, it's not an answer. Actually, we're not looking for answers, aren't we? That's the point of lectures and discussions and seminars. So that's all that I can say. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Nice of you. Thank you.
So there are a few questions in the chat box, which I would like to read. The first question that I can see is that if you can elaborate something and dwell more on how Brexit increased Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And there's another question, if you want to take, what do you think about the Europeans' approaches towards Ukrainian refugees? While they were totally against refugees from Eastern Islamic and African countries, is this also a very clear sign of Islamophobia and deep fear from the East?
Okay, let me take the one on Brexit and Islamophobia. I'll make 2 points. I was personally very horrified by Brexit when it happened, because the UK is one country that I look at very closely. I have written 2 books on the UK. A week before the referendum happened on 23rd of June 2016. A week before the referendum, a British MP, Joe Cox, was killed in the streets of a parliamentary constituency by a man shouting "Britain first." Okay, so it was very chilling, the whole episode. Normally you think of British streets as being not very prone to violence. Not that there is no violence, but it's more peaceful than let's say the US. 6, 7, 8 months later, when President Trump came to power, in his inauguration, he made the point "America first." That was the signature theme of his speech. Now that set me thinking that the more nations put themselves first, Britain first, America first, whatever first, the more they are likely to relegate humanity to the last. And this is my concern about the growing tide of nationalism across the world. There's a certain kind of irrationality where, in an irrational sort of a way, one nation wants to put itself above every other nation. So it becomes this kind of a rat race to put one's own country first. And we all know that if there is this kind of a rat race, the whole world suffers. Climate change cannot be solved by nation states. As far as Islamophobia is concerned, the organization in Britain called Tell Mama, which is an organization which reports Islamophobic incidents, recorded a manifold increase in incidents of where people were names were called, or hijabs of women were pulled off. Again, it had to do with the idea that Britain as a nation had to be cleansed of immigrants. And the major immigrant presence that was felt as a threat was the Muslim immigration presence. And the simple reason for this was because in 2014, there was a tide of immigrants from Syria, which actually will help me come to the next question. So I think that was the reason. Any form of national purism will give rise to the idea that there are some people who don't belong here. And I think this is a very dangerous idea, because in human history, no one can stop migration from happening. I mean, that's how America was created. That's how Australia was created. That's how India was created. And this idea that we got here first and we will not allow people who came after us to come is, I think, a very, it's a very dangerous and unfortunate kind of an idea. So, the hatred was palpable. I think that what Brexit did was that, as I said in the analysis I made, it allowed the genie of racism to escape from the multicultural bottle. The multicultural bottle that could never counter, but merely contained racism. And I think Brexit let that loose. In exactly the same way that, Trump let a lot of that racism loose. In India, we are witnessing that, with the BJP government, especially in its second term. And the kind of absolutely atrocious statements that are made, which should make everyone feel ashamed at the fact that statements of this kind can be made with impunity in the public sphere. This is a very telling commentary on us as a society, the fact that statements of this kind can be made with impunity, that people can get away with it, and not just get away with it, benefit from it. So it's a kind of a telling commentary on the kind of society that we have created. I mean, this is not to kind of cast blame on anyone, but to kind of indicate that perhaps what we need is a certain kind of collective, thinking over of where we have reached. Now, the point about Ukraine, I think it's a question that is well taken, that yes, there is much greater acceptability to refugees from Ukraine. I mean, I was watching the news last night, and it seems that 1.4 million people have been made refugees because of the crisis. And it's likely to go to 5 to 7 million. The British Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, referred to the tide of refugees as a swarm. So I think what that reflects is a particular kind of a mindset where the refugee is dehumanized. Anyone can become a refugee. It could happen to any one of us. But there are some people who are so smug in their self-conception of their own, of their own security, and that they feel that, refugees are just a problem and they're just statistics. A refugee is not a statistic. A refugee is an experience of someone being rendered homeless. And the effect on this is on children is really, really kind of, psychologically speaking, is very profound. Because when a child loses a home, the child loses a neighborhood, the school, the relatives and friends in which the child grew up. I mean, any child psychologist will tell you that for a child, the most immediate and secure environment, of course, is the family and then the neighborhood. For a child to be kind of uprooted and plucked away from that secure context and then to be thrown into the hostility of crossing borders and the dangers of marauding mobs is something that perhaps may be too much for the psychology of the child to kind of contend with for the rest of his or her life. So yes, I mean, there is deep-seated racism in this, but let me also say one thing, that I think that Ukraine represents a tipping point. A tipping point. Of course, Yemen was destroyed by Saudi Arabia with the help of British and American armaments. Yes, I accept that. Syria was destroyed, because of the Russians backing Assad. But that doesn't mean that at this moment one does not stand with the Ukrainians. Mistakes were made earlier. That doesn't mean that we can make another mistake. I mean, Zelensky, the Russian president, he's become quite iconic. I watched his speech to the British House of Commons yesterday. He quoted Churchill. He quoted Shakespeare. And it was a 9-minute speech that at least had me riveted in terms of how one nation is being completely ruined. So I do take the spirit of the question, but at the same time, I would suggest that this is really the time to stand up for Ukraine, because this is something which cannot go on. And an aggressive nationalism like Putin's Russian nationalism must be stopped if the world is to be saved.
Thank you, sir. So the next question, please, Ravi, if you want to ask, you can go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for the session we had today. Sir, I was going through a book written by T.K. Omen about the security and the perspective. And sir, here it has been written that W.E. Gladson, in an article entitled Aggression in Egypt, published in 1877, wrote, Mohammedanism now appears in the light of experience to be radically incapable of establishing a good or tolerable government over civilized and Christian race.
Yeah.
That is, Muslims were seen as being incapable of ruling justly or even competently. Sir, so here the question arises that is it that the European perspective, when the nation state was in a formation, it has been showed that we are the superior of all those, and because of that, it's coming back in a particular this point of time where every class is taking place because of those superiority which they think of themselves. Is it the main reason behind this Islamophobic idea which is spreading?
Yes, I think so, Ravi. I think so. And I think, I'm glad you could Gladstone going back to the 19th century. I think the modern manifestation of that is this idea that Islam and liberal democracy are incompatible. I think that this is one of the most widely prevailing ideas that at least I have come across. But people say that, there's a certain kind of incompatibility between Islam and liberal democracy. Now, what that has made me do is to suggest, well, if you think of the theorists of liberal democracy, people that I teach, for example, John Rawls talks about the background conditions of liberal democracy. Now, what ideas of this kind do is that they deplete the background conditions of liberal democracy. And by depleting the background conditions of liberal democracy, create the ground for the collapse of liberal democracy. Where is liberal democracy collapsing? Hungary, where you have a leader, Viktor Orban, openly Islamophobic, openly saying he doesn't believe in liberalism. Where is liberal democracy collapsing? In the US, where you had someone like Trump undermining democracy. Where is liberal democracy collapsing? In the UK, where Brexit has led to an undermining of democracy. So I think, it's in many ways what that famous expression of the chickens coming home to roost. A lot of these things that were said in very racist ways, coming back to boomerang on these societies. So that is how I look at it. I just make one more point, which is that when people make this point about Islam and liberal democracy, what I tell them is that why do you presume that Muslim peoples or Islamic presences cannot positively contribute to democracy in terms of the advancement of democracy? I mean, Arab and Islamic civilizations in their golden period contributed so much to modern science, as all peoples of the world have done. What makes you think that it can't be done again in the 21st century? People don't have an answer to this because this is an exclusively racist mindset, which presumes that, Europe was able to kind of rise in the Renaissance, as if the European Renaissance happened without any kind of input from other parts of the world. There's a Lebanese historian of science, George Saliba, who's written a book on the Arab contribution to the European Renaissance. The fact that, the Arab world had a very significant role to play in terms of translation of some of the great classics of Greek philosophy and science. It arises from, I think, a certain kind of ignorance, a certain inability to understand that there are other parts of the world which can be as refined and civilized as Europe itself. So it I think arises from an insularity of the European mindset, which needs to be kind of brought out of its insularity and shown that there are other parts of the world which have attained great achievements in science and culture and literature. That would be my response, Ravi.
Thank you, sir. We have few more questions if you want to take.
Absolutely, yeah, that's fine.
The one question that we have in chat box, you're actually trying to compare the two narratives that goes on with the Palestinians, or like in case of Palestine, that they have been targeted as terrorists when they actually resist. But in the context of the Ukraine, they have been actually termed as the heroes. So how do you see these two narratives? This is the one question that has been given in the chat box. And one question is about the banality of the concept of Hannah Arendt, that how do you see in the present context? Because as we have seen, I can also reflect back to the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem. So he was not that much upset that what he has done, and he has clearly mentioned that this was my duty to do that. So like in the present context, sir, what is the given condition that we are in the context of banality of evil in today's world?
Let me take the Palestine-Ukraine question, because Palestine is an issue very close to my heart. I've never been to Palestine, but I have written about Palestine because I've been hearing so much about it. It's a very strange narrative of dispossession. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 that happened 5 days before the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution happened on 7th of November. The Balfour Declaration was issued on the 2nd of November 1917. It's just like 67 words long. Now, the best way to describe the Balfour Declaration was one nation promising to another nation the land of a third nation. That is what happened. Now, the fact that the Palestinians were dispossessed is never taken into account when people talk about, Palestinian terrorism. Now, the point about terrorism is that all national struggles go through a terroristic phase, whether it's South Africa or India for that matter. I mean, think of the revolutionary terrorist movement of Bengal. Of course, Gandhi came later and took it in a non-violent civil disobedient direction. But I mean, what most people forget is that the state of Israel itself was created through terrorism. That there was a poet called Ben Hecht who would, publish these articles and poems in newspapers saying that Zionists must celebrate terrorist acts. The word that he used was, let's all, do a holiday in our hearts every time a terrorist attack happened. And there were many of them. There was the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. There was the killing of the Swedish mediator Count Folke Bernadotte. The ethnic cleansing of many villages, but the one that I can remember because I've read about it in historians like Ilan Pape, Der Yassin. So I mean, it's a completely one-sided narrative which is able to do this because it can control the narrative. That is really the problem. Okay, now Ukrainian resistance. I mean, the Ukrainians are putting up a pretty interesting fight. Many young men are enrolling. Many people from across the world are going to Ukraine because they feel that it is important to defend one country from another country's aggression. And I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, the setting up of Israel was an example of settler colonialism. Right now, recently, Amnesty International has, in its most recent report, referred to Israel as an apartheid state. So the tide is turning now, the narrative. So there was this this kind of a single narrative of Palestinian terrorism. Again, to go back to that, that talk, some people that I was talking to earlier, and when I asked them the question about terrorist organizations, so the question that I asked them is, who pioneered suicide bombing? Everyone thought it was the Palestinians. Does anyone know who pioneered it? Anyone who knows which terrorist organization was the one which was the pioneer of the suicide bomb? Anyone who can guess? This is the great disadvantage of conducting these things online. I can't see people. But the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, were the first organization that pioneered the use of the suicide bomb. And the idea that it's only, the Palestinians who do it would be an example of this. So yes, I mean, there have been two narratives. One narrative was able to overpower the other narrative because it had the media, it had money, it had control over the narrative. That tide now is turning. And I think to go back to, Pragya's question, the way that I responded to it was that I suggested that what we are witnessing is a new global order that is emerging. And when that new global order emerging, hopefully, we can see that all the iniquities and injustices of the past global order will hopefully go away. But that would require many of us to make the right decisions, to say the right things. A new global order will not just emerge on its own. It will emerge from the collective decisions that many of us take. And therefore, we are all implicated in the forging of this new order. So I'm looking at Ukraine as a kind of a tipping point. As a tipping point in which, when of course Russia is the aggressor here, which is not to say that the US and NATO have not been responsible for this. Yes. But right now, my own position would be that it's more important to call out Russian aggression and stop this from happening to Ukraine. And at the same time, then kind of train the focus back on all the nasty things that European colonialism, British imperialism, and American neo-colonialism has done in the world. That must not be lost sight of. I'll come to banality of evil in terms of the way that I've tried to understand it. I mean, the only way that I can explain this is in terms of people looking the other way. I mean, and why do people look the other way? People look the other way because of simple careerism, not getting the promotion that they desire, not landing the job that they want to. I think that is why people look the other way. That's the point that Arendt makes about Adolf Eichmann. When Arendt saw him for the first time, she looked at him as a pretty absurd sort of a man, not very bright. And the reason why he did the nasty things that he did to the Jews was because he thought that this was his best way of self-promotion. And I think that really is what is preventing people from speaking out against evil. It's important for people to just stand up and say, no, you can't do it. that itself would be enough to end the kind of, this kind of all pervasiveness of evil all around us. I'll just make two more points. One, I'm reminded of what the famous British political philosopher Edmund Burke said, which is that the reason why evil prevails in the world is not because of a lack of good men, but because good men just don't speak out. They just keep quiet. Khamosh, dar ki wajah se, opportunism ki wajah se. One last point. This morning I was reading about Justice Aqil Qureshi, who retired yesterday, or I think on the 5th, from the Rajasthan High Court. He never got the promotion and elevation that perhaps he should have got, for the simple reason that he passed judgments that ruffled the ruling establishment. Okay? And the point that Aqil Qureshi makes is that I did what I had to because it was the principle. Let me just read out what he said, because I have it right in front of me. I was discussing this with certain people. And this would be what would help the world perhaps become a better place. This over-careerism that we have. Just bear with me a minute as I find that particular quote. Qureshi should have been elevated to the Supreme Court. Why? Because he didn't pass opportune judgments. He talked about Justice H.R. Khanna, the man who passed the famous, who wrote the dissenting judgment in the ADM Jabalpur case. Never elevated to the Chief Justice. But the point is that it's the principled position that may lead to some people becoming unsuccessful in the conventional term. And therefore, what Qureshi says is this. In his speech, farewell speech, he says, and he addresses this especially to lawyers. He says, always live by your principles, because success is sweeter when you reach your destination through the straight path. Failure, which is a product of principled living, is more satisfying than success, which is found on compromises. I think it's the compromises that people make. And then the last line that he says is absolutely beautiful in terms of the hatred that we are experiencing across the world. And yes, be kind and gentle to others, because life is too short to fill it with hatred and distrust. That is it. It's as simple as that. The capaciousness to perhaps, forego the promotion because it's more important to speak out. And there have been people in human history who've done that. And I think that's really what we are waiting for right now. For the right people to stand up and say, no, you can't do it. And I think that would be the end to the banality of evil. Because the banality of evil exists because we take those banal decisions, like piffling promotions, which I'm not denying is not important. But then in the larger sweep of human history, it's very important for those people to stand up and say, no. That would be the end of the banality of evil. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. There's another question if you want to take by Charu Damur. Charu, would you like to speak?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Actually, I won't be able to open my camera. Actually, I'm traveling right now.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So my question is quite simple, and I think it's one of my recent doubts which I faced as a graduate. Like, I am pursuing political science honors. I'm in 3rd year, so I have this dilemma, and I think you might be able to, rectify it or tell me what's the solution to it. So basically, as you mentioned that there is different narratives which are being circulated by different people, and it depends largely on what is their personal ideology. But again, social media is something the algorithm is something that if we follow one type of news, and so basically we are only seeing one perspective and we are neglecting the other altogether. So as a student who's pursuing political science honors, how can we actually get a wider picture rather than sticking to one narrative? And because I think with age it just gets much more, it's just hard for us to rectify us, correct us if we are wrong. So that is something I myself struggle sometimes. So if you can let me know that how we can balance both the narratives, and we can discuss, we can decide as to what is actually happening and what is just propaganda. So I hope you're getting my question.
I got the point, Charu. Where are you doing your political science honors?
So Zakir Hussain Delhi College.
Delhi, okay, Delhi University. I don't know many of the questions. many of you have asked me, I mean, and again, to be absolutely honest, I don't have answers. All that we can do is try to collect together, try to explore the answers. How does one end prejudice? I mean, honestly, I don't know, because I have been completely, I mean, I am in a state of bewilderment right now. I mean, to be absolutely honest with you, things just seem to get worse every single day. You wake up in the morning, you pick up newspapers, and the world becomes much, much worse. Countering the narrative, I mean, the thing about the narratives that we latch onto is that we latch onto the most convenient ones, the ones that kind of reassure us, that make us comfortable, that kind of confirm our prejudices. I think that is really the problem with the narratives that we accept. I think one thing that all of us have to do is that we'll all have to admit that we all have prejudices within us, every single one of us, that no one can be completely devoid of prejudice. And then use that prejudice to kind of open ourselves out rather than close ourselves in. That would be, the closest that I can come to a solution. So when I talk about prejudice, I'm often very disturbed by people who will claim a certain kind of objectivity. They will say that I am neutral, or I am objective, or I have overcome prejudice. I don't think anyone can do that. I think quite often life is this constant battle with our own inner demons and our own prejudices. And it depends on how we handle those inner demons and prejudices. Do we allow those prejudices to close ourselves in? As Charu was saying, as we age, we tend to become much, much more complacent about the prejudices that we hold. Or do we allow those prejudices to open ourselves out? Now, I'm not a great fan of the philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer for his politics, but certainly when it comes to prejudice as being able to open oneself out and become what Gadamer calls the force structure of understanding, that is something we can certainly do. It's something we can do with the set of received and available prejudice that we have with all of us. Not allow it to kind of close ourselves in, but allow that to kind of expand outwards. Now, what that requires is a certain sense of, to get rid of our own exceptionalities, the belief that we are a superior people because we believe in this religion, or we are a superior people because we belong to this country. No, I think that's not the right way to do things. This belief in our own exceptionality is, I think, what reinforces the prejudices. It reminds me of the Stoic philosopher Heracles, who famously said that an individual is at the center of a series of concentric circles, and every circle, it becomes bigger. And the point that Heracles made is that the closest concentric circle belongs to your family and your neighborhood and your friends, and then you kind of expand outwards to the nation and society. And the point that he made was the outermost circle is constituted by humanity. Okay? That every single person is connected to every other person. To redeem our humanity, we must be able to draw that outer circle to ourselves. And I think that would be the best way to overcome this idea that we are in some way exceptional, that other people are inferior. I think that the ability to redeem humanity, which is what the humanities are all about. I mean, since you're a political science student, Charu, that's what the humanities are all about. It's about human beings genuinely being able to be humans, which is unfortunately the really missing element in the world right now. People, we've made it that much more impossible for ourselves to be humans. Okay, and therefore the redeeming of our humanity by connecting it with people who we may never meet. And this is perhaps a politically opportune moment to make this point, because the coronavirus pandemic has underlined the link that all of us have to everyone else. No one is safe until everyone is safe in an increasingly globalized world. And so therefore, Charu, my answer, if it is an answer at all, would be the need to redeem humanity by connecting ourselves with the outermost circle of humanity, rather than being kind of gung-ho about this idea that because I believe in this religion, I am superior. I mean, in the belief system that I grew up in, from a Muslim background, I've often been very struck by this aggressive posturing about the superiority of Muslims, which also every other group. This belief in the exceptionality of oneself is, I think, what prevents us from being able to understand the humanity in all of us, and also in many ways diminishes the humanity within us. And every one of us, I think, is responsible for this. I mean, it's not just Muslims or Jews or Christians or Hindus, every single one of us. So the idea that we are all in this together, is perhaps one of the best ways to redeem that humanity. So Charu, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for this erudite, cognizant, and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you for deep-threading the complex issue like Islamophobia, though it's a moment for me. It's likely a very sentimental, very emotional lecture that you have given, because I'm also working on refugees, so I can sense the sufferings they have been going through, and especially in terms of Islamophobia as well, if it is connected to any refugee. Though it's likely I just like to portray my joyousness to listen to you, and I'm thankful for the dialogue for giving me this opportunity to host this session. It was a very happy moment for me to listen at you and to your thought-provoking ideas. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Imtiaz. It's always a pleasure speaking at India Law. Thank you, Behzad.
So I think, sir, we can end the session if you allow.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.